All right. Welcome everybody to this second in the series of seminars with Artisan. And Dave Baxter is here to join us to tell us a little bit more about the analyzer and comparator tools in Artisan. There's a lot of information here, so this recording will be put up on our website as well as Artisan's YouTube channel for perpetuity, and so that you can check everything and scroll through the video and find the information you need. I'm Evan Gilman. I'm the creative director from Royal Coffee, and with me today is Dave Baxter. Dave, if you'll take it away.
I will. Thank you, Evan, and thanks for having me back. Appreciate being able to do another in this series of Navigating Artisan webinars. This one is getting the most from Artisan's tools, and as Evan mentioned, there's a lot of information packed in here, and so I think you'll probably want to watch the video back to look at sections that are of particular interest to you, because I'm going to move pretty rapidly, and I apologize for that on the first viewing, but you can always, with the video, rewind and spend some time to look a little deeper.
And as always, we'll have the questions and answer Q&A panel open, so you can submit your questions in the chat. Yes, and we'll get to them at the end.
Yes, please. Note down some questions along the way so you don't forget, and submit those, and I'll be more than happy to get answers for those at the end of the presentation.
Awesome.
So let me start off here. Again, I'm Dave Baxter. I'm a member of the Artisan team. Been working on the team for a little over 7 years now, and having a lot of fun with Artisan and, of course, with roasting. Artisan is software which is open source. It's free to use for logging your roasts. It's a very mature code with lots of features, and we're quite responsive to our user requests. One key point, Artisan, when using Artisan, your data is private. It's not stored on the web anywhere, unless you want to push it there, but otherwise your data is private. We don't force updates on people. The Artisan software is multilingual and it runs on a multitude of platforms, but it is community supported. There is an additional program called Artisan.plus. Let me just talk about it for a second. It's an inventory management system for Artisan. It is subscription-based, so it does require you to pay for it, but it has some great benefits, one of which is direct import of green bean data from supplier partner sites, one of whom is Royal Coffee, and the crown jewels are all directly importable into your Artisan account. There's a link on the page for each of these coffees, and you just click that and it will add it into your Plus account. And we're very proud of our relationship with Royal and appreciate their support. So Artisan Plus, do give it consideration as an adjunct to using Artisan. A question I get asked quite often is, how can I help Artisan? It's a great question. By subscribing to Plus, you'll help support the ongoing development of Artisan. It costs money to buy the hardware that we're asked to support, and there are other costs associated with providing Artisan, and your support by subscribing to Plus will help to offset those costs. Other things that you can do are to join the Artisan team, whether that's to write some code or write some documentation, do some design, translations, provide support to other users, or training. We welcome all of that. So please reach out if you're interested in joining the Artisan team. And the other way you can support Artisan is just make a financial donation. So let's jump on into today's agenda, which, as Evan mentioned, is to go into depth into the analyzer and the comparator tools. So why analyze roast profiles? Well, artisanal roasting it's all about making great coffee, right? And when we log our roasts and we get our roast profile curves, by examining them, we can get some very useful insights. And learning from those profile curves is going to inform us on how to improve future roasts, and also allow for objective comparisons. And that's the heart of what these tools can do for us. And by doing so, that leads us to being able to roast even better tasting coffee and to develop the ability to consistently repeat desired results. And I think that's a very important skill of the artisanal roaster, is to be able to repeat results. So first we'll talk about the Artisan Analyzer. And at its heart, what the Artisan Analyzer does is it objectively compares two BT curves and outputs a whole bunch of detailed data about the comparison of those two curves. The first step, it generates a background BT curve, which is a mathematical fit to the actual BT curve that you fed into it. That's true except when you're comparing two real roast curves to each other. And that comparison in the analyzer is done over what we call the interval of interest. And that's typically 2 minutes. And it runs from 2 minutes before first crack starts until the coffee is dropped. That time is adjustable, but the 120 seconds is a pretty good number we've found over a lot of profiles. One keynote, all analyzer results are in Celsius. Even when the artisan mode is in Fahrenheit, the results are in Celsius. And that allows for consistent comparison between different roasters and over time if you change the units that you use. So it's always in Celsius. So let's jump into an example here. Here's a typical roast curve. And if I run the analyzer, and I do that by pulling down the tools menu, and I will choose, in this case, auto all, which is going to run the curve fits for all of the different fits that we do, and I'll get into that in a moment. And the output comes in these two boxes that the first time you run it will be in the center of the screen, kind of blocking everything, but we can just drag those out of the way so that we can see the curves. And what you'll what you'll notice here is that Artisan has now shaded the graph, and there are 3 shaded regions, or one region which is unshaded, this is lightly shaded, and then a darker shade here. The unshaded region, this is what I had called earlier the interval of interest, and this is where the analyzer does its work, is in this area. The next area in the lighter shade is the area over which we fit the curve, and there's on the BT curve, we start here and we run to here, and in this case, it's starting at dry end, and as I said, it always ends at the drop, and we fit the curve through that region. And here I've highlighted in blue that curve fit, which is sitting in the background, and you can kind of see it here and the tail of it coming out here. We also generate the RoROR from that fit curve, and you can see that highlighted here. Now, I keep talking about a curve fit. What do I mean by that? What is a curve fit? And why do we care? So let me talk a little bit about this. It's a little bit mathematical, but I don't want you to get hung up on the math. What I want you to walk away with here is an understanding of the curves and what's different between them. And the first curve fit that we do is what we call a quadratic. It's based on an x squared term, or time squared in this case. And here's the fit to this example BT curve. And you can see that the green is a little bit below here, and it pops out a little bit above, but otherwise through the region from the beginning point to the end point, it's not too bad of a fit. And then in the area prior to where we're fitting this curve, it starts to deviate from that. But again, we really are only interested in this region here. If we plot the RoROR for that fit curve, you see that it's a straight line. Well, that is by definition with a quadratic fit, it's always going to be a straight line, because the rate of change, or the rate of rise of a squared curve, is always a straight line. The second kind of curve fit that we do, we call a cubic. It's based on time cubed as well as time squared and time. And you can see in this example, it's maybe a little bit better fit because we only see the red peeking out just a little bit in this region here. The third type of fit that we do is based on the natural log. And this is a concept you don't particularly need to understand, but the reason why it's here is some years ago, there was a discussion on Home Barista about a theory that maybe bean temperature curves would follow a natural log type curve because it's a natural process. You're pushing heat into a crop, and it may follow a natural kind of a log. And there are some cases where this actually is a pretty good fit. In my experience, most of the curves that I've seen will fit best in the cubic or the quadratic, but the natural log is here as well. So looking at what the RoROR's curves look like for these three, again, the quadratic is a straight line. The cubic, now notice it's a curved line. And in this case, It's kind of like a ski slope coming down here. It's curved, but it is constantly dropping and maybe turning up just a little bit at the end here in this example. And the RoR of that natural log curve is also a curved line and dropping as well. So let's go back to our example. And I'd like to point out that the analyzer, as well as the comparator, will give you good information regardless of what your roasting style is. Some people subscribe to, I have to have a straight line declining RoR curve. Others say, well, if it declines most of the time, that's good enough for me. And there is a variety of styles that you may employ, and the analyzer can be used in any of those. And I'll show you some examples of where it can fit with different roasting styles. So back to our example, we have our background curve here with, excuse me, with our RoR, and these two boxes. The upper box is based on the BT curve fit. That's this line here. And there's data which is relative to it, and I'll go through all of that in just a moment. Then in the lower box, the upper portion is based on the RoR curve. And then below that are some data which is very useful to know what settings were, and a couple of other pieces of information that's always useful when you go back and look at one of these analyses to know how it was set up, because those settings can have an impact on your on your analysis. So as I mentioned, when you run auto all, there are three curve fits which are done: the x squared, x cubed, and the natural log, and they're shown in this upper box. And below here, it says curve fit x squared, and what that's telling us is that we're looking at the x squared fit in the graph here. We can't show all three of those layered on top of each other, nor do I think you would want to see all of that data. So this is telling us that we're looking at the x squared curve. The first analysis result is RMSE BT. And what the heck is that? Well, that's the root mean square error. And the root mean square error, if I highlight an area here of the BT curve, you will notice that our background curve, which is the fit curve, is just a little bit different in this region from the actual BT curve. And so RMSE BT measures the error or the difference at each of the sample points of the roast between the two curves. It finds the mean of all of those error values and then takes the square root of that. And that's what this number is. You don't really need to worry about the math to understand that. What's important to remember is that the closer to zero, the more exact the fit. So in this case, we have an RMSE BT of 0.53. That's not too bad. The absolute value here really is not important to worry about. If you ask me, hey, what's a good number to have here? Well, it really depends, again, on your roasting style, on your machine, and to some extent on the beans that you're roasting. But the closer it is to zero, the closer it is a match to this mathematical curve that we drew. So that's a figure of merit, which is useful to keep in mind and is useful for comparing one roast to the next. The next column is MSEBT, and that is the same value. It just is not the square, well, RMSEBT is the square root of the MSEBT. MSEBT was part of the original version when the analyzer was first introduced into Artisan. And at some point in the future, it'll probably go away, but we've kept it here because the analyzer has been a part of Artisan for a while, and a number of people have developed data that uses that MSE figure, and so it'll remain for a while. But if you're a new user to the analyzer, just use RMSEBT. These two are really two different sides of the same coin, and both of them, the closer to zero, the more exact their fit. The next value is RoR delta at FCS, and I've indicated here with this vertical bar what we mean by that, and it's how far off or how far away from that fit curve is the actual RoR at the point in time of first cracked start. And that's a useful number to look at from one roast to the next. It can inform you as to how things have changed during your roast. And then the next column is max plus and max minus, which is the difference, the maximum difference above the fit line and below the fit line. And that's just repeated here. And it's shown for each of the 3 different kinds of curve fits. Again, we're looking at the x squared, but the other data here, there's 2 thresholds that can be set for the analyzer. There's a samples threshold and delta threshold. I'll talk about each of those in just a few minutes, but this is showing you how those values are set. The next value is your sample rate in seconds. Very useful to know because you may not recall what your sample rate was for this particular profile. The smoothing settings are shown as well because that's important. Changing smoothing settings is going to change analyzer results. And sometimes when you turn smoothing up, it doesn't give you better results. So don't try to chase better analyzer results with more smoothing. What you want to do is set your smoothing to a point where where visually you can see the information in your curves well. And you want to have the minimum amount of smoothing turned on that you can and still be able to see good information. We also show the delta span and the smoothing for the delta curves. And then there's a new value here, which is called the fit RoRoR. And what that is that's the slope of this ROR line. And I'll talk more about that in a second. And then we also show the actual ROR at FCS. And while you don't need an analyzer to tell you this, it's a useful number to compare from one roast to the next, because this is really telling you what your momentum is as you're heading into first crack. In the lower box here, the segment analysis, I said before, this is based on the ROR curve. And the analyzer internally breaks this ROR curve up into segments. And a segment is defined as the point in time from, or the points in time from where the ROR curve crosses the fit curve. So our first segment here starts out below the fit curve, but it's at the start of our interval of interest. And then the ROR curve crosses the fit curve at this point. So that's our first interval. It goes above for a while, and then it comes back down below. So this is our second interval. And then we have a third interval that starts here and runs to the very end. And the fact that this looks like it's touching the fit ROR curve at the end, again, that's just coincidence in this example. So there are three segments in this analysis, and we show the start time and the duration in seconds of that. Of each of those. And then we show the max delta for each segment. That's very similar to the max that we talked about in the upper box. The next is a value called swing. And what swing does is it looks at the difference from how far below, or could be from above, in one segment to how far above it is in the next segment, basically adding these 2 bars together. And you can see here that one bar was negative, so we throw away the negative sign, add these 2 together, and we get what that swing is. That's very useful when you're taking a look at crashes and flicks, and I'll dig into that in just a little while. And we measure that as a value between each successive interval. Now, a very interesting number is the area between the curve divided by seconds. This we measure for each of the intervals, and then we have a number also for the entire interval of interest. But it is literally just the area between these 2 curves. And we calculate that area, and then we divide it by the number of seconds in this interval. So you see there's a value calculated for each of the segments, but the real interesting number is not the individual segment numbers, it's the overall number over this entire interval of interest. And in the case of this example, it is 0.84. And that's very useful number to know, to see how close is your ROR curve to whatever fit curve you may be trying to compare it to. And over time, you can see if your roasts are getting closer or further. And it is one of the most useful numbers coming out of the analyzer. So I mentioned a moment ago about this fit RoRoR. That is the slope of the ROR line, and it is only relevant in the x squared curve fit when this line is a straight line. If the line is a curved line, as it is in the other 2 curve fits, there's a different slope at each point on that curve, so we can't have a single number for that. So, RoRoR, what does it tell us? Well, here's another example, and I'll draw here in green the fit curve for this BT curve. And let me take away all of the other curves except for the green line so we can focus just on it. And this vertical gray line is just showing us where first crack starts. And you can use that just as a reference point in time. I'll add another line, another BT curve here in red. And you'll notice that this one is a little curvier than the green line. It's got more curve to it. I'll add a third curve, the blue one, and it has less curve. It's more of a straight line BT. So if you remember from our analyzer, the green curve has a fit RoROR of minus 2.36. The minus means that it's declining. It's sloping downward. This red curve, which is curvier, has a steeper slope. And so its fit RoROR is minus 3.96 or about minus 4. It's a bigger slope, a bigger downward slope. And the straighter one, the blue line, is a lower slope that has less to it. It's closer to 0. And so the less curvy line has a lower RoROR, and a more curvy line has a bigger RoROR, or bigger if you throw away the minus sign here. So the absolute value is, it's a bigger number. And so what the RoROR tells us is how curvy is our BT curve. And you may or may not care at the moment about, well, why do I care? But when you start looking at multiple roast profiles, it is instructive to see, is your BT curve more curvy? Do you have a steeper RoROR? Or is it less curvy and it's more of a straight line? And is that what you want, or do you want to change that? So let me jump back into examples here and talk about the thresholds and some of the detail about the segment analysis, because I want you to understand what's going on under the covers, even if that's not something you're going to actually use every day to look at all of the detailed data. So we have a curve here. This is a little bit different than we've looked at before. You'll notice there's quite a few transitions here where it's going above and below the fit curve that we have. I did an X squared fit. Well, actually, I did all three. But in the case of the X squared, you notice the RMS EBT is 0.1. That's really quite low, which means this is a very good fit to the BT curve. And when we look at the ROR curve, we notice that the ABC over seconds is at 0.46, which is also a pretty good low number. I've indicated here with the red dots the, the 6 segments that we have in this particular example. And you'll notice that while there's a crossing at each one of these dots, where it looks like the ROR curve crosses the fit curve, looks like in between here, there are actually some other places where there are crossings, and there's not a segment called out there. And you might wonder, why is that? Why is that segment not called out there? So I've marked the last 3 segments that we're looking at here, and we'll take a little bit deeper look at what's going on in this time area. So in blue here, with the blue arrows, I've indicated places where when you zoom in and look at these 2 curves, you'll say they actually crossed. And and why are there not segments here? Well, it has to do with the delta threshold. And what the delta threshold is setting is how far away from that fit curve does the real ROR curve need to go before it's recognized as actually having crossed? When is it significant? Because just a little tiny cross like this may not be significant enough to warrant calling that a new segment. It could lead you into having just a huge number of segments when it really doesn't matter. So that's a threshold. It's the distance away here. And 0.6 is the default value. Normally it works very well for the analyzer, but we'll change that in a second, and I'll show you what the result is. The next threshold is the samples threshold. It defaults to 3, and that's, in this case, the sample rate was 2 seconds. So 3 samples at 2 seconds, that would be 6 seconds. And that's the width of this bar here. So the sample has to go more than 0.6 degrees C per min away from the fit curve, and it has to last longer than 6 seconds to be considered significant. And that's why these little ones in between don't show up as being other segments. And you can adjust the analyzer settings under Config Curves and on the Analyze tab, as you see here. Here's our number of samples and our delta ROR, the actual to fit, which is considered significant. I'm going to change this value down to 0.3. And now you see we've got a bunch more segments have popped up because we've made this threshold lower. But not every one of the crossings that we had identified before, like this one here, not every one of those actually becomes a segment. We would need a lower threshold for those to all come in there. And you'll notice that one of the red ones has actually gone away. What's happened is that crossing or that interval start has moved back to this point in time because this little blip downward has met the threshold. So it's moved back. And now we have quite a few more segments. Well, is more segments or less segments a good thing or a bad thing? Well, not necessarily. It really depends on what you might want to look at in here. But the real thing to notice is that our area between the curves divided by seconds is still 0.46. It hasn't changed a bit by these threshold settings. And that makes sense because the area between the fit curve and the actual curve hasn't changed because we've changed these threshold settings. But there may be some instances where you want to take a close look at something that's going on in your ROR curve and would want to change one of these thresholds. But for the most part, your defaults will work well for you. Well, what about darker roasts? Well, here's an example of a roast which has gone into second crack. We run the analyzer on it, and now I want to point you to what this swing value can be useful for. And here we're looking at the swing from this segment down to this segment, from segment 2 to number 3. And we see a -4, which is degrees C per minute again, which is actually pointing to a fairly large crash. Now you may say, well, I can just look at these graphs and I can evaluate that graph with my eye. And the answer is yes, you can. But now with the analyzer, you can actually put measurements to it. You can get objective data out to compare one roast to the next, other than just eyeballing it. And that can be useful, particularly when you're trying to repeat results or compare the effect of changes that you may have made in your roasting recipe and how you've gone about changing your settings. If we look at the following flick, it's about the same order of magnitude. It's about the same size here. So we have a pretty good crash and a flick going on. Excuse me. There's a new measurement, which is new in version 2.8.0 of Artisan, which is just about to be released. And it takes advantage of the mouse crosshairs. And I talked about that in the earlier webinar on getting the most from your roast curves. And here, if you turn the mouse crosshairs on using the shortcut Control-Shift-T on Windows or just T on the Mac, and then click and drag to make the measurement, we're showing that the RoROR of this little segment, the slope from here to here, is a -6.5 degrees C per min. And when you compare that to the RoROR of this fit curve, which is only 2, that gives you an indication of how steep or how strong is that crash, not just how big, but also how strong it is. So a useful additional new tool to be able to make measurements when you're running the analyzer. Another curve here that's running into second crack. So we run the analyzer on it. We get a 0.45. That's not too bad. We don't have a direct comparison for this kind of a curve to say if it's better than or worse than, but it's not too bad. And our overall ABC per seconds is 0.46, still not too bad. But what we do notice is that this roast curve has a very long ramp to it. And the interval of interest is still 2 minutes prior to the start of first crack, but that's only a very small portion of this quite long ramp. So while the x squared fit is pretty reasonable in the case of this curve, this is an example of where you might want to go back into the settings for the analyzer and change that interval of interest to make it longer, to pull it back to an earlier region and get a better look at what's going on throughout that longer ramp and that period before first crack. And you may ask, well, why do we only look at a period of time that we set before first crack? Why not look over the entire curve? And the reason for that is that in this earlier part of the curve, particularly on drum roasters, this is an area where your temperature probes are still getting settled with well, first their temperature falls because the beans that got dropped into the drum were cold, and now everything is warming up and things are still settling out, and the trustworthiness of the temperature data coming back from those curves is not as good as it is later in the roast. And so it's during this period that we're really most interested and where the data is the most solid. So a couple more examples before we move on. Here's a roast that was done in a fluid bed roaster, and you'll notice, well, you can see that the BT curve has a little bit of jagginess to it, and that's reflected in the RoR curve. Well, let's go ahead and run the analyzer and see what it's telling us. Well, it's done a fit. In this case, it's showing us again the x squared, which is a straight line. And let me pull the segment data out of the way so we can see the whole curve here. What we notice in the curve fit analysis is it's telling us that the x cubed has a better fit in this RMSE-BT. So maybe we should take a look at what the x curve or the x cubed curve looks like. So I'll do that by pulling down the analyzer from the tools menu, and then we choose fit BT to x cubed. When we do that, we run the x cubed. That's what we're displaying here now. The RMSE-BT is still 0.5, as we saw from the previous analysis, because nothing has changed. And you see the curved line here for that x cubed fit, and that looks like a pretty good fit. And what you might notice is that while this is a pretty good fit, it also, the analyzer that is able to see through this noise pretty well and fit the curve pretty well, even though there's quite a bit of noise on the BT curve, which is also reflected here in this RoR curve. You'll notice we have an awful lot of segments in this analysis. Of course, you can see that where this is going across the RoR, the fit RoR, and our ABC per seconds is 2 for this roast. We have no smoothing turned on, and our delta span is set to 6. But what would happen if I went and added more smoothing? Well, let me turn the smoothing up to 10, and you'll notice the BT curve got a lot smoother. The RoR curve got a lot smoother as well, but a couple of things have happened here. Our ABC seconds was 2, and now it's dropped to 0.64. It's gotten a lot better, and of course, that's kind of obvious when you look at this, that there's less area between these two curves. But our RMSE-BT, the fit to that BT curve, has actually gotten worse with the additional curve smoothing. And that is a fallout of the way that the curve is fit mathematically. After it's been smoothed, the original fit was fitting to the original curve, and this is to a smooth curve that has slightly different points. And so in some cases, not necessarily all, but in some it can get worse when you actually do the smoothing. If we go back and set our smoothing back down to 0, but instead I'm going to turn up the delta span to 12, I'll double it from what it was before, our RMSE-BT goes back to the original 0.5. That's because our smoothing is 0. But the ABC seconds has now gone somewhere in between our original and what we had when we had lots of smoothing on at 1.23. For this particular curve where we have this kind of jagginess on the BT curve, having a delta span of 12 may not be a bad compromise to be able to see pretty good data in here. But what you want to do, and my point in showing you these things, is to point out that changing smoothing settings does not always improve the analyzer results. So what you don't want to do is try to chase getting a good analyzer, what you think is a good analyzer result, by changing your smoothing settings. Keep the smoothing settings consistent, and that's going to allow for valid comparisons of your roasts with other roasts over time. So keep things constant when you're running the analyzer. A couple more examples before we move on here. Here's one that shows some noise. It's also got kind of a long flat period here in the RoR. When I run the analyzer, notice that the best fit is going to be x cubed. So we'll run the x cubed fit once again. And now look at this RoRR curve that was fit for the X cubed. It's kind of interesting because it's rising pretty rapidly and then turning around and falling. Probably a red flag, unless this is the result you're trying to get and to repeat. But if you're looking for anything that's declining continuously, this would be a red flag for that. But maybe this is your roasting style and you want it to be that way. Here's another curve that has kind of the double hump, that is a longer curve that's running out just about into second crack here. And you'll notice that this is also an X cubed fit, and it also has a little bit of that upward turn at the beginning. And then it turns back downward. Again, the analyzer can be very instructive to show you what's going on with your curves and in comparison with curves. So a quick summary before we move forward. Set your smoothing to the minimum that gives you the most information, and keep that smoothing setting and your thresholds, keep them constant. The analyzer default thresholds really work quite well, so you probably will not need to change them, but there may be some special circumstances like a very long ramp or very noisy data, although I doubt it with the noisy data, but maybe where you want to change those settings and adjust the start of your interval of interest when the ramp is especially long. Talk about making a template for a minute. I've been asked quite a few times about being able to take the output curves from the analyzer and using them as a background template for a future roast. And it turns out that's actually very easy to do. It's quite possible, and I'll show you how. So here's another example. In this case, I'm showing you what my power curve is, or the gas settings that were used during this roast. And if you're going to have a background template, you probably want to have your event settings for gas and air. I'm only showing gas in this case, but it's just as true if you had gas and air, and your drum speed if you're adjusting that at all. But your events showing. And so I'll run the analyzer here. And here we get our typical result. And now I'm going to clear the analyzer results. You can do that from the menu with clear results, or you can use the shortcut Control-Alt-K on Windows, or Command-Option-A on the Mac, and that will clear the data boxes that come out of the analyzer. So now we're looking at the curve we started with, and in the background is our analyzer fit curve. So what we want to do next is to create a virtual device. And it's not necessary to create this virtual device after you've run the analyzer. You could actually have it as part of your regular setup and turn on the display of these curves only when you want to see them after you've run the analyzer. It's necessary to do one step in the extra devices tab here, and I'll mention that in just a second. But let's assume right now we're starting with a brand new virtual device. So I've created it here, and I've set the color to be hot pink, so it'll stand out when we go back and look at our curve. I've labeled the analyzer's fit BT curve. I've called it template BT, and I've called the RoRR curve the template BT RoRR. I've entered two symbolic equations here for these curves. The first one is B2. B2 stands for background curve number 2, and background curve number 2 is the background BT curve. Background curve number 1 would be the background ET curve, but in this case, we absolutely want the background BT curve. And for the RoRR curve, I'm using RB2, which is the RoRR B2, or the RoRR background curve number 2. I've unchecked the, if at any time you have a question about these symbolic equations, just click the help button here, and all of these variables will be displayed on the help page. I've unchecked the LCDs because we don't need to have those displayed, but we do want to display these two new curves. So I've checked curve 1 and curve 2, and I've also checked delta axis number 2. And that's because this RoRR curve is an RoRR curve, and we want to display it on the delta axis, which is this axis over here. So the key thing that you have to do after running the analyzer, whether you've set this virtual device up at this point in time or you've had it always set up, is you have to click Update Profile, because we have to take the results coming out of the analyzer and update our profile with with those results inside of this virtual device. When I click Update Profile, all of the virtual devices will be updated. All of their values will be updated in the profile. So if you have a profile that has multiple virtual devices, and some people do, all of those will be recalculated. Typically, it's not a problem, but I just want to caution you that it will cause all of them to be recalculated. But here we click Update Profile, and we go back into our profile, click OK, and get out of there. And now you can see in hot pink, here are our two new curves that we brought forward. So at this point, you could clear the background curves because they're still there. You can't see them because they're hidden by our hot pink curves, but they're still there. And you can see the, in the case of the annotations here, we can see they're actually still hiding back there. So you can clear that out of the way if you don't want to save that with your profile for your template. So you clear those and then save the profile as a template background that you can use for a future roast. So here I've loaded that same curve into the background, and you can see we still have all of those curves showing by ticking events. What I've done here is I've opened the background dialog, and that's done under the roast menu item, open the background dialog, and I've clicked events here. So I've turned on my gas event, click ET and BT because I want to see both my original ET and BT curves. And then I've added as an extra one curve, my template BT from the extra devices, and for extra two, I've got my extra BT RoRor. So we add extra devices to the display, and then let me just say it's possible if you want to replace the original bean temperature curve and its attendant RoR curve, that's possible to do as well. But we'll leave that as extra credit for another day for how to do that. But with this, now you have a background curve that you can bring in and use for your future roasts that has that information that was generated in the analyzer. So here's a summary. This is repeated at the end of this presentation as just a step-by-step for how to create your template. But I think a lot of people will find this very useful to do that. So compare to background, that's another part of the analyzer, and I think actually one of the most useful when you want to improve your roasting from roast to roast. One of the most useful features within the analyzer. And here I have that double bump roast that we saw previously that had the slightly curved X cubed RoR curve fit. And in the background is another very similar roast to that. So I may want to compare these two roasts to each other. And I do that in the analyzer menu by choosing fit to background. And in this case, the analyzer is not going to generate new curves. It's just going to run the same calculations against the background curve and this foreground curve. And here's the result. The RMS EBT is 1.83. So it's grown quite a bit. And you'll find, I think, in your roasts that this number gets considerably bigger than when you're actually doing curve fitting. That is, unless you're tracing really, really well. And when your tracing gets better and better from roast to roast, you'll see this number start to fall. And notice here that the ABC per secs is at 0.67. Pretty good. These two curves seem like they're tracking each other pretty well. And new in version 2.80, we tell you what the background alignment is when you're making a comparison to the background, because remember, your backgrounds can be aligned on the roast events, and that will definitely impact the analyzer's results. And here I've gone and changed the alignment from charge to dry. And what you notice is that our ABC per seconds has dropped pretty dramatically to 0.36. But interestingly, the RMS EBT went up to just about 3, and you can see that the BT curve has moved away in the background here. But doing this comparison with a background curve is very, very instructive. Here's another example of the same thing. This is more of a straight line kind of an RoR. I'll do the fit to the background, and you'll notice that again the RMS EBT is up above 1.5. Which is fairly typical, I find. And then ABC per seconds is about 0.76. But as you get better and better in tracing and repeating your results, you'll see this value come down. Now, I'd like to point out a feature which has been in Artisan for actually quite a long time that probably most of you are not even aware of, but it's displayed at the bottom of the graph area whenever you have a background curve displayed. And it's this CM equals, and then there's two values. CM is an abbreviation of Casino Mocha, which is a cafe in Budapest, and it's where the idea for these values came from. And so it was called CM. And there's two values here. The first value is for the ET curve, and the second value for the BT curve. And what they are is a very, very similar measurement to this RMSE BT, but done on the ET curve and then also on the BT curve. The values will be different than what you see from the analyzer, even though the math is pretty much the same, but it's calculated over a much longer region. And so the numbers are going to be a little bit different, but the same rule applies that the closer these are to zero, the closer the match of the two curves. And I point this out because when you see CM down here, it's a quick way when you have a background curve to see how close are the two curves without necessarily going in and running the analyzer to do this background fit. So key points coming out of the analyzer. RMSE BT, probably one of the most useful numbers that you get out of it. The ABC over seconds for the entire region of interest is also a very key number to use. These others is detailed information. You may or may not want to use them. Swing, use it for your crashes and flicks when you want to extract objective information about them. And remember that this is always telling you what you're looking at, which curve fit you're looking at. Fit RoRoR, kind of a new value, but it is instructive to tell us how curvy is that BT curve. And while the absolute value here doesn't necessarily tell you a heck of a lot, knowing the difference is one curve more curvy or less curvy than another, that is actually quite useful when you're comparing multiple curves, and your actual ROR at first crack is a useful number that we pull out too. And remember, analyzer results are always in Celsius. Don't forget that. It's easy to make a template. Just copy this in a virtual device and you'll get your template. Again, here's the step-by-step. That'll be repeated at the end of the presentation. Fit to background, very powerful. Give this a try. I think you'll find it very instructive as you're working on your roasting technique. And for those who may want to know, these are the units that each of these values are output in. Since we just put the numbers in these boxes, these are what the units actually are. Okay. Let's move on to the comparator. This is another really powerful tool. It allows us to overlay multiple curves. We can align those curves on roast events. We can display special events like power, our gas, our air, and so on, and compare them from one roast to the next. It allows us to show the between batch protocol if it was recorded and compare that between multiple profiles. And new in version 2.8.0 is the ability to view and compare roast phase times and their percentages, very much like what's currently available in the I can't remember the name of the report now. It'll come to me in just a moment. But it is in one of the Artisan reports. So let's start with an example. I have a curve we looked at a few minutes ago and a background curve, which is very similar to it. If I pull them into the comparator, I do that by pulling down the tools menu and choosing comparator. The comparator opens up with a new dialog box, and you can see color-coded our two curves showing in the graph area here. And I have something on my screen I need to pull out of the way. Won't pull out of the way. Okay, well, in the upper part of this dialog box, there are 4 selections that you can make. And the first of those is what roast curves are being displayed. And I can turn them on or off here. I've just turned on the ET curves. So we're now looking at ET, BT, and the BT ROR. Events is also chosen, and we can choose which events to show in one of the other options. I'm sorry, these events are the roast events, which are indicated with the dots on the graph here. So we've got charge, drive, first crack start, and in some cases here we may have a first crack end and drop. Next is the alignment choice. We can choose to align on roast events. I mentioned before, currently we're aligned on charge. Let me go and change that to align on dry. And you'll notice there's a vertical gray line, which is our alignment indicator. And that's just a reminder as you're looking at the graph where these curves have been aligned. Next, I'm going to turn on showing that power event. That's what I call my gas. And we have those two curves overlaid and displayed here. You can choose from this pull down if you want to look at other of those events. And in the lower part of this dialog, we have the curves that are currently open in the comparator. Now, if you want to open another file in the comparator, or anytime you want to open a file, you can click the Add button right here. You can drag and drop that file onto the graph, and you can also double click on the file on the desktop or in the file manager, and it'll open it up in the comparator when the comparator is open in Artisan. If I were to double click on the header of one of these rows for one of the roasts, that will cause the profile to get opened in the Artisan viewer, and that's very useful when you want to take a detailed look at one of these curves in isolation without having to exit the comparator. And new in version 2.8 is this phase display. There's a gray bar at the bottom of the screen, and as you noticed, I had a drag cursor when I go on top of this gray bar and I drag it up, and we can see that we've got our phase bars showing the three phases that we have. Each profile's batch information is shown here. We have the times and the percentages for each of the three phases, and the total time of the roast is here. Now, if you open the axes dialog from config axes, I would definitely recommend checking when you're in the comparator, and perhaps most of the rest of the time, to check the time auto. And what that does is it's going to make sure that your roast curves are well framed in the time axis so that you can see all of the roast, and that the beginning time and ending time on the axis are appropriate for the roast that you're displaying. You can set the delta axis for the RoRR curves automatically by ticking the delta BT. I have not in this case because I've already set my axis here at a pretty good value for the curves that we're going to be looking at, but it's helpful also to check that delta BT if you want that to automatically be set. And I might just make a comment that there's a new instructional video that Marco has added to the Artisan YouTube channel that goes into detail on this dialog for the axes, and will give you some detailed information. It's an excellent tutorial to give you detailed information about how to use each of the settings in this dialog box. So let's go back to our view here. And we can close the comparator by unticking in the menu the comparator item under Tools, or we can close by clicking the close icon on the comparator dialog box. So let me do that, and we go back to seeing our curves here. And I'm going to reset Artisan to clear those curves out, and then restart the comparator once again. And when we do that, of course, there's no curve to feed into the comparator. So the comparator is going to ask us to open some curves, and it'll open a file dialog box so that you can choose the files that you want. And you'll notice here, I have a couple of zip files. Well, what's up with that? Well, you can put a number of your profile files, your A-log files, inside of a zip and group them that way, and they can all be opened together in the comparator. And there's a few other places in Artisan, where you can group and open things in a group. The ranking report, that's what I couldn't remember earlier. The ranking report is another place where you can do that. And so I have a number of A-log files inside of this Burundi.zip, and I'm going to open that. And here they are. There's 5 of them. So with one click, I can open those 5 files. I don't have to, if I want to return to this analysis, I don't have to go back and open each one of those files or remember which of those 5 I had. So we're back into the comparator, and the comparator remembers the window settings that we had before. So we're only showing 2 of the phase bars. So I'm going to go ahead and drag that up to show us all 5 and open up my window here a little bit to also be able to see all 5 of the curves that we brought in. If I click on one of the curves in the list here, what Artisan does is to highlight that curve and gray out the rest by graying out the rest. So this was blue to begin with, it remains blue, but the rest become gray. And now I can kind of focus in a little bit more on that. And it's possible, oh, I'm sorry. If you hover your cursor over any one of these profiles in the list, it'll pull up a tooltip that pulls information from the roast properties so that you can examine detail about that particular roast. And in this case, this is useful to me because I know, oh, this was the second roast of the day that day. It's possible to highlight more than one curve. So I've turned on the purple curve now as well. So I have 2 that I'm looking at and 3 that are grayed out. If I'd prefer to just hide those 3 curves, not have them gray, just untick the check mark, as I've done here, and those 3 disappear. They're still open inside the comparator, but they're not being displayed. And you can view the 2 that you have chosen. There's a shortcut to turning them back on. Instead of having to click them individually, you can click at the top here and it'll turn all of them back on, but they're still grayed out. So to get them turned on fully, I first uncheck one and then the second of those curves so that nobody is highlighted any longer. And now all of my colored curves have been returned. Now, just a note about how things are drawn, because they're drawn on top of each other. The curve which is, or the profile which is shown at the top here is drawn last, so it's on the top. So the drawing order is from the bottom to the top. And what that means is if there's a curve you want to look at, it may be obscured by the curves laying on top of it. So if I highlight the red one here as an example, well, we can see the red curve pretty well out in this area, and we can see it pretty well out in this area. But through here, it's hidden because it's underneath the other curves. So what I can do is just click on it, hold, and drag upwards to drag it to the top. And it's very easy to change the order of any of the profiles that you have open here. And so now I have my red curve is on the top and I can see it fully. Very handy, very handy capability to have. So I've turned the highlight off. Now we have all of them being viewed here. I can turn back on my ET to look at them because even though these curves look kind of like they're overlaying each other pretty well, although they're not aligned out in this area, we notice that the ET for these profiles, at least when they're aligned on the dry time, the ET curves are quite different for these profiles. Next, what I want to do is show you how we can change the view. And the first thing that I'm going to do here is to go from roast into BT plus roast. And so now, or BBP plus roast. So now we're taking a look at our between batch protocol as well as our roast. And because I had that auto time checked in the axes dialog, notice that the time axis has changed so that we can see the full profiles, including their BBP now. Let me take the phase information and move it out of the way so that we can get a bigger view of these profiles. And I'll turn off the ET curves and then also drag the dialog box here out of the way so we can fully see the curves that are here. If I change our view once again, I can change it to just BBP, and that means that it's going to end at the charge time. So we're looking at everything back in time before charge. And as such, all of the profiles are have to be aligned on charge. And you'll notice that here that the alignment has changed to charge. It's also grayed out because we can't change it. It has to be aligned to charge. In version 2.8.0, there's a new shortcut key, which is G. And what that will do is toggle the axis view. So you can rotate between roast plus BBP, and the BBP while you're in the comparator. And this shortcut key will also work in the normal graph view as well. So it's a very handy new shortcut to be able to move between each of these. So I'll hit that G key now, and we rotate back into viewing our BBP plus the roast. I was aligned, well, I am aligned on charge, and I want to change that just a little bit in a moment. But first, I want to show you how to use the mouse cursor to make some measurements in the comparator. And the first thing I'm going to do is click the mouse in the graph area to change the focus. You'll notice that our dialog title bar is now kind of grayed out, so I know that I'm in the graph area. And I'll hit the D key on the mouse or on the keyboard to turn on the mouse cursor, excuse me. And we talked about that in the previous Getting the Most from Your Artisan Curves webinar. You hit the D key, turn on the measurements, and now we have a display that shows the time and the temperature where the mouse cursor is pointing. So I'll drag it over here to where this bundle of profiles is, and I have it laying on top of one of the profiles events. And if I click on that event, what you'll notice is a display over here in the message area that's telling me that I just clicked on the SF1-525 profile. That's our purple one down here at the bottom. And that I'm on the FCS, the first crack start event, at 7 minutes and 53 seconds and 193.6 degrees C. So using the mouse to click like that, you can identify which curve you have interest in there. You can also zoom in, as we're about to do here, at any point on your curves and get a closer look. So I'm going to change the alignment now to the turning point, because I want to show you how to do something which is very useful when you're trying to see how well is your curve tracing going. And that is looking at the turning point coming out of your BBP and after charge. So let me turn off turned off ET. I'm turning off the power display so that we don't have any clutter on the screen here. And I will click zoom to rectangle and zoom in on a small rectangle. If you're interested in all of these functions up here, they're covered in the previous webinar, but I'm going to zoom in on this little area of these two curves. And now I'm going to turn off zoom to rectangle, so when I click on the mouse, it's not going to be confused with the zooming action, and turn on my mouse crosshairs because I want to make a measurement. And now I'm going to click and drag. And so I'll click here on the lower curve, drag up to the upper one. And what I see is that the delta temperature between these two curves is 0.8 C. So that's saying that these two curves were a pretty good match. They could be better, but reasonably good at the turning point. The other things, of course, you want to look at turning point are time and also how were things after that. But this just shows you that it's possible to go in and make measurements within your curves to see how well you're tracing. What we find here, if I turn back on the ET curve, they were quite different in this case. So this is probably a little bit more random that they actually matched up. But if you're looking at repeating your results and trying to get consistency, you can use these tools and the mouse cursor to make some detailed measurements on your curves, highlight the ones you want to look at, and dive in with the measurement capability. Last, I want to show you, I've been talking about tracing and repeatability. Here's a number of roast profiles that look to be pretty good matches. What you can notice here is while they overlay each other pretty well In time, the roast events are spread a little bit. That wasn't as consistent as one might like, but the BT curves are in a pretty tight pack, and the RoR curves actually follow each other pretty well as well. And even where they dip a little bit here towards first crack, they're a pretty good match. And I can go back and use the analyzer on 2 of these curves and see how different is that sort of little crash that exists in there. If I pull up the phase display, lots of useful information here in all of this, and I think you'll find the comparator can be used to do an awful lot of work in evaluating how your roast profiles compare to each other. Remember that you can go in and click on one of these roast events to get information about which profile that event belongs to, what's your roast cursor on top of, and highlight, and with drag and drop, view the curves that you want to inside of the comparator. And a final comment, throughout this presentation, I've had the comparator dialog overlaying the window here because that supports being able to do screenshots. But what you can do is arrange these windows independently on your screen when you're working within the comparator, so you have an unobstructed view inside of the comparator window here. Key points with the comparator: use it to overlay multiple curves, show, highlight, or hide one or more of those curves. You can show or hide your your roast curves. You can view and compare the phase timings and percentages. You can add or delete profiles without ever leaving the comparator. Align those profiles on your roast events. View and compare the between batch protocol, a very powerful part of the use of the comparator. Use the axes to better view your profiles, and use zoom and pan to examine the details, and the mouse cursor to make measurements. And don't forget that you can group a set of profiles in a zip file, particularly if you're going to look at them more than once. It's a great shortcut to just copy them into a zip file and then open them all at once. And so with that, I want to say thank you very much for your attention. I know we've moved pretty quickly and through an awful lot of material, and I appreciate your attention to this. And I want to say thank you also to the team at Royal Coffee, and especially Evan for having me back to host this once again. And at this point, we can move to some questions, and I certainly hope answers.
Thank you so much, Dave. This is like an incredibly powerful tool for roasters. And I think like, especially what you've covered today is really effective for a lot of production roasters out there. Like they're going to get a lot of value out of this, like comparing everything they're doing with their coffees that they're roasting, time and again. And also for people at home who just want to get better and more consistent at roasting coffee, like there's some very specific metrics they can use now in order to really hone their practice and get the best out of this as possible. For questions, we haven't had too many. Martin asked if this will be available for viewing later, and it absolutely will, not only on Artisan's YouTube channel, but also on our Vimeo channel for Royal Coffee. So it'll be up for sure. If there's any other questions, you can ask them in the chat or in our question and answer section.
Anything anybody is needing to know? We have also with us Marco Luther, who has been with Artisan since the very beginning. And I'm
Hi there to all. Hi there to all. I compliment to Dave for, I think this is what James Hoffman was talking about. We have to get more nerdy. Now that I'm not talking myself, but just listening in, it's really nerdy, this tool. Wow.
It absolutely is, but I mean, I think the nerdier we can get about this, the better we can hone our practices and have like actual metrics for knowing if we're meeting our goals. So it's good.
Yeah,
Of course, sure. We need good tools. Sure.
Flint remarks that it sounds super useful if you had a roaster in 2 different ambient temperatures. So
yes,
yeah.
yes, it is. So just to comment about my own roasting, I pretty much always roast outdoors. I'm trying to fix that with an indoor roasting setup, but I roast outdoors. So the environment is changing every time I roast. And that has always been troublesome, but these same tools have actually allowed me to be able to learn how to compensate and then be able to go back and compare those roasts and see how well did I compensate. And I have learned from that how to be a much better roaster and deal with changing environment. And while that's an extreme case, even for those who roast indoors, the environment is going to change from day to day. Your ambient temperature will be different from one day to the next, as will your relative humidity, and the barometric pressure changes. And so all of those change, and it's these tools can be very, very helpful.
Do you use that also? I know that you roast in a session several batches, I think 4 or 5 or something like this. Does it help also to learn how to do things different for the first batches compared to the later batches, because the machine changes its thermal state?
Absolutely, absolutely. So as the number of batches goes that I've roasted goes up, or the later batches, the roaster tends to get hotter and hotter. It's retaining more and more heat. So the between batch protocol has to get appropriately adjusted in order to bleed that heat off before starting the next roast. So the way that I tend to deal with that is in the between batch protocol to try to get the roaster at the same, with the same thermal values at the beginning of the roast when I can. Some people, I think, tend to compensate as the roaster gets hotter. They change their roasting profile style to try to repeat the same outcome with the beans. But I focus on the between batch protocol to try to get things set up to start the roast at the same way every time.
So same way you're looking at the BT and ET temperatures, right?
Yes.
Is this?
Yes.
But
I'll notice, what you can notice is when if you start with a roast that has a higher thermal mass so that things move somewhat faster, detecting that and knowing for the next BBP that the roaster needs to be cooled just a little bit more. So the way that I compensate is I tend to drop the lower part of my BBP, the bottom temperature, by a couple degrees, and then bring it back up to start with the same charge every time.
Okay, so so you modify actually a little bit blindly the between batch protocol by experience from your previous
by experience. So it's a little less than blind.
Yeah,
it's kind of blind to find out what the right adjustment is. But having found that, I know I've learned enough to know when I need to compensate and by how much.
and it will be interesting to see if we discussed that before, the two of us. If we try to estimate the heat or the thermal state of the roaster by adding another thermal element just under the cover, which is directly around the drum. So if we try to measure this temperature of this cover, which is inside the isolation of the roaster, if this would be a better indicator basically of the thermal state, and if we try to design our between batch protocol to get that in a constant way, if this helps actually.
Yes. So I was very intrigued when I saw your note about that, and I want to do that.
Yeah, yeah.
For my roaster, that's a pretty easy modification to
Exactly.
make.
I think for most classical drum roaster, it's quite easy to put. There are these thermal elements that measure surface temperature, and you could just put it from the outside, underneath the isolation, the outside on this shield, so to speak. Yeah. We'll try that too.
Have you had any success using other instruments to measure the barometric pressure, relative humidity, and environmental temperature of the room and port that into what's going on in as like a automatically notated thing in Artisan? Or
Yes, so Artisan will, with the right measurement device, of course, and they're available from Fidgets, you can automatically record the ambient temperature, the ambient humidity, and the ambient barometric pressure at the beginning of every roast, just automatically without having to do anything.
That's great.
That's easy to set up in Artisan, and then when you start the roast, it goes and makes the measurement and records that in your roast properties.
I do that for a while now, and I think the parameter which has the largest influence might be the barometric pressure on the roast, because the room temperature, at least in my case, is not varying too much, and the roast is so much hotter, so it doesn't matter too much. But the humidity, I don't know. It seems not to influence much.
I haven't seen that much variation. I think the biggest variation I've seen is really less the room temperature and more the bean temperature when they drop into the roasters. So
okay, the green bean temperature.
Yes, the green bean temperature.
More thermal mass there for sure.
Yes,
than there is in the air.
Yes. And so having consistent temperature of the green beans is very helpful. It's very helpful.
So there's a case for refrigerating all your green beans.
Excuse me?
There's a case for refrigerating all your green beans in that case.
Could be. I don't know if dropping colder beans is better than dropping warmer beans, but having it consistent.
I think there are machines that are heating up the beans to save energy.
Yes.
Before they fill. So
yes.
Freezing the beans would be counterintuitive to me.
Yeah. Watch out for condensation too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it seems that we've answered all of our questions. Flint also says that he intends to add an indoor setup or an additional outdoor setup, but he'll need to shield his burner against wind. So, yeah, enclosing the roaster in some sort of space is a good idea. Yeah.
Yes. I think wind is a problem.
Wind is definitely a problem. So you do want to be shielded from wind.
Yeah,
it's even producing a back pressure into the drum from the exhaust, so that the wind is and of course the cold air towards the machine.
Yes,
it's also a problem.
Yes, so it matters quite a bit. So on the screen here, I've put up some links, and these are useful. My email address is there, but also the artisanscope.org website is the gateway to everything Artisan, and there you'll find links to be able to download the code, to be able to get help, whether that's through the FAQ or links to our GitHub page from there. There's a quick start guide. We also have a blog that's pretty nerdy on the detail of features and what's new in each new release. And when you go to the blog.
And we have this new YouTube channel.
Yes. Oh,
it's not listed here yet because it doesn't has a nice link also. So you find it from the main Artisan page. There's a click, an icon, a YouTube icon you can click. Yes. And I plan to fill that with some basic tutorials, just not that fancy stuff like the analyzer, but just the basics to have those all documented in a easy way with short videos.
Yes. So again, the artisanscope.org, everything is linked to from there. So If you need to go to one place, that's where to go. And the others are just to highlight them as well. But you can get to the blog from artisanscope.org. And if you're on the blog, there's a search capability there. Some search terms to support what I've talked about today are listed. And Artisan Plus is at artisan.plus. And please subscribe and help support the ongoing development of Artisan.
Don't forget to make a donation.
Please.
And expect this new version Dave talked about to be released quite soon in some days.
Yes, and with some new capabilities that I highlighted here. And so we're pretty excited about the new release, and we want to get it right. And as soon as it is, we'll make it available.
Excellent.
Great.
Okay. Well, thanks again, Evan. Thank you, Marco.
Thanks, Dave, for the presentation,
Dave.
and for all this preparation of the presentation, especially.
Okay.
And thanks to Royal Coffee for hosting.
Yes.
You're very welcome. And let's stick around. You're going to go through the important slides at the very end. So I'll just mute myself, and we can go through those last slides so people have reference.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
See you later.
Bye-bye.